understand socialism? Yes. Energy, means of production. So I thought, why not bring in a biblical perspective? Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth is a Christian worldview, and address some of the concerns that people like Bill Moyers and from PBS, yeah. Your tax dollars, mine at work. And others like Al Gore and John Kerry have expressed. So joining us now is E. Calvin Beisner. Dr. Beisner is PhD, is the founder and national spokesman for the Cornwall Alliance for Stewardship of Creation. And I really appreciate your work because you asked the question, is your son or daughter, niece, nephew, or someone in your family are we getting green propaganda fed to them? The answer is yes. The answer is a big time yes. But also we see the debate, and as it's been taking place, Dr. Beisner, I want to first off welcome you to the broadcast. How are you, sir?
Well, thank you. I'm doing fine, and yes, indeed, our young people are most certainly getting a lot of green propaganda in their schools, and it starts all the way down at kindergarten. In fact, as much as 3 years ago, the state of Maryland adopted a requirement, the State Board of Education did, that young people had to demonstrate environmental literacy in order to graduate from high school. Now, it might have been nice if they had required them to demonstrate just plain old literacy, but maybe that would teach them how to think for themselves.
Well, that's what this is all about. I mean, statism is really people view it as, oh, it's against the individual. No, it's about pushing God out and not recognizing God as our Father, our Creator, where our rights come from. But you could forget more in a day than I'll know in a lifetime on that. So I'll shift back just for a moment to the global warming and some of the things that have been said about climate change. Excuse me, I've got to get the most recent incarnation, climate disruptions that have been said about global warming. Here's a piece, newsbusters.org supplied this morning about a view of a scientist who has very, very strong opinions about what should happen to people like you, me, climate deniers. Here's part of that report. Roll it.
Welcome. Last week, the scientist David Suzuki was here to tell us what he thinks should happen to politicians who ignore or deny evidence that the Earth is heating up.
Our politicians should be thrown in the slammer for willful blindness. If we are in a position of being able to act, and we see something going on and we refuse to acknowledge the threat or act on it, we can be taken to court for willful blindness. I think that we are being willfully blind to the consequences for our children and grandchildren. It's an intergenerational crime.
The problem is, if that should happen, if politicians were to be convicted of willful blindness to the fate of the Earth and future generations, there would have to be mass arrests and lots more funding for new prisons. We're not talking about a mere handful of culprits. It's hard even to know where to start.
And, of course, lunacy, but that said, remember how this debate is shaped. It's through snide remarks and the belittling of others, always citing one particular stat of 97%. Here's John Kerry at Yale giving the commencement speech. Here he is referring to climate deniers like you, like me, and those politicians. Roll it.
You might not see climate change as an immediate threat to your job, your community, or your families. But let me tell you, it is. We do nothing. And it turns out that the critics and the naysayers and the members of the Flat Earth Society, if it turns out that they're wrong, then we are risking nothing less than the future of the entire planet.
Dr. Beisner, when the debate is couched in a way of catastrophe and 97%, it's not in that clip, I have one later, that somehow we are just not getting the message and we're some obtuse, I guess. I mean, what is your response when you encounter these types of characterizations in discussion and debate?
Yeah, Suzuki, of course, doesn't want debate at all. I mean, you're talking about debate. Suzuki doesn't want debate, and that's typical of those who have a materialist worldview instead of a theistic worldview that recognizes the difference between the creator and the creation and recognizes that human beings are made in the image of God. If we're made in the image of God, then we're capable of reasoning. But of course, if matter, energy, and motion is all that exists, then there is no such thing as reason. And so if you don't like what the other fellow says, the appropriate response is not to try to debate, it is instead to shut him up. One way to do that, of course, is to jail him, and that's what Suzuki wants. That's the typical way of thinking for people who are materialist naturalists. Kerry, of course, says that it's all about absolute catastrophe and we have to save the planet. The problem is that even the fairly worst-case scenarios put forth by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change don't foresee anything like that. Instead, they foresee, for instance, through the end of this century, perhaps maybe a foot and a half of sea level rise, and in reality, it's more likely going to be something in the neighborhood of 6 inches, half a foot. These are the kinds of statements that you heard from Suzuki and from Kerry there are incredible exaggerations. They are hype to the nth degree. But what the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation does is we bring together really excellent scientists and economists as well as theologians to integrate a biblical understanding of the world that God has made and of human beings and our relationship to that world with good science and economics. And what we would argue is that, climate changes. It's always changed. Human activity, it probably contributes a little bit, but natural forces far outweigh ours. And the consequences of human emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are most certainly not catastrophic. And they're not going to be catastrophic because the amount of warming driven by added CO2 is really pretty minimal. The computer climate models have far overstated the amount of warming that has taken place. Over 95% of them have been grossly wrong about the warming that's taken place in the last 35 years. So the models are wrong, and if the models are wrong, then since they're the only basis of fear, there is no reason to fear.
That would be a great response to the 97%.
The 97%, by the way, is based on a survey of scientists that asks only two questions. One, has there been significant warming since the mid-19th century? And two, has human activity contributed significantly to that? Now, I would say yes to both of those questions. So would every skeptic about global warming whom I know, because the crucial questions are not, has it warmed and have human beings contributed significantly? And remember, scientists think, a significant influence, 1, 2, 3%, that's significant. No, the crucial questions are, have human activities been the primary influence on global warming over the last 150 years? And the answer to that is most certainly no. And second, is the warming already dangerous, or is it in the foreseeable future going to become dangerous? And the answer is no. And third is, would it be more cost-effective for us to try to prevent future warming by reducing our use of fossil fuels, which are our most abundant, affordable, and reliable sources of energy, aside from nuclear, which the eco-freaks all hate anyway? Or would it make better sense economically for us to grow our economies through the use of abundant, affordable, reliable energy, and therefore be prepared economically to adapt to whatever the climate future is? People live well all the way from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara Desert. So an increase of 1, 2, even 3 degrees Celsius in global average temperature is not something that would be difficult for human beings to adapt to. And the wealthier they are, the better they adapt.
Dr. Beisner, when we're addressing climate change, too often we just leave it as that and say, do you believe in climate change? do we need to do a better job of not accepting, as Newt Gingrich was masterful at during the debates in 2012, I would say, and was the fact that he would sit back and say, I don't accept the premise of your question, because it's very... Go ahead, please. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. We can't let the other side define the terms. For instance, they'll want to call somebody a climate change denier, when in fact what I deny is that human emission of carbon dioxide is the primary driver of global warming. That's not denying climate change. My goodness, if anybody's denying climate change, it's the people who think that in the absence of human emissions of CO2, we wouldn't have climate change. Well, the whole history of the Earth's climate, all through geologic history, shows that the climate is always either warming or cooling. It goes in cycles. So it's actually the people who want to say, oh, we wouldn't be having global warming if it weren't for CO2 rising in the atmosphere. No, they're wrong. The geologic history clearly shows that they're wrong. So what we need to focus on is getting the questions right. And when you do that, it turns out that it's only a very small minority of scientists who believe that human emissions are the primary driver of warming, and who believe that it's dangerous, and who believe that the appropriate response is for us to spend trillions of dollars switching from abundant, affordable, reliable oil, coal, and natural gas as our primary energy sources to very unreliable and extremely expensive wind, solar, and biofuels. Last, by the way, of course, meaning that instead of growing food to feed people, we grow crops to burn up in our gas tanks, which means we make food more expensive around the world, and that hurts the poor of the world more than anybody else.
And the air makes the air dirtier. Tell me this, Dr. Beisner, why is President Obama and the left continuing to bring this up after it's been such revealed as not really registering, according to polls, in the concerns? But not only that, President Obama said this is the new foundation of the economy. Should we keep that in mind as they keep bringing it up, and why is it so important to them?
Well, I think different groups on that side would have different motivations for it. A lot of them in the environmental movement have always been sort of elites who want to be in control of other people's lives. But if you want to control people's lives, the quickest way to be able to control the most people's lives and the most aspects of their lives is by demanding that you control energy use, because energy goes into everything that we do. It's powering the fact that you and I are on the phone with each other, that you're on the radio. It powers our cars, it powers our lights, it powers our factories, everything. Energy goes into everything we do. So if you want to take control of the economy, if you want to centralize economic control, energy is the target. It's the prime target. And so if you have a big government philosophy, if you have a centralist philosophy instead of a free market philosophy, if you want command and control instead of people being free to make, to produce and to market and to trade with each other as they please, as long as they do so in a peaceable manner, well, hey, energy control is the way to go, and so-called dangerous climate change is the best rationale for government control of energy. So that's a major driving motivation, I'm sure, for a lot of them.
Dr. Beisner, it's been a pleasure and privilege. Look forward to having you back on, and maybe even bringing in another person to debate and discuss. Fantastic. The Cornwall Alliance, Dr. E.